Welcome to CHI's Masters of Suspicion. We're in week 5 of our course on the American Gothic, looking at the crises of certainty and control. Review. Last week we discussed the end of Irving's sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon and how it frames as dangerous the unthinking desire for spectral worlds. Although Crayon's construction of Gothic worlds around him, inspired by the art and wizardry of Shakespeare and the virtues of the natural world that he pursues, invite spectral worlds, they do so in a way that's deprived of certainty. One never senses that Crayon, unlike Crane, becomes confused about reality. Crayon's use of the Gothic enhanced the surrounding world with possibilities, while Crane's use, which mirrored his desire for economic exploitation, tended to rob objects of their inherent worth. We ended the class by reflecting on Irving's writings about Native Americans, which showed the real-world horrors wrought by the mindset that Crane employs. The bodies of the exploited, including those working and living today, haunt us as ghosts that we train ourselves to overlook, the same way that we overlook the bodies of massacred Native Americans. One way to understand the sketchbook is as a guide to seeing these living ghosts who are victims of this world's mindset instead of overlooking them. So that's, I think, something that Irving intends readers to be able to do after reading the book, after putting it down. So that was last week. This week, we examine Edgar Allan Poe's well-known tale, The Black Cat. Poe deserves his reputation as a Gothic artist, and the fact that this story remains alive in the public imagination, I believe, is a testament to his gifts. Rather than idling, though, in speculation concerning the truth of the story, examining whether or not there were really two cats or what their relationship was or things like that, my interest is in investigating the psychology of control that Poe critiques throughout the story and examining its ramifications. So here we go. Poe begins The Black Cat with the following sentence, quote, "For the most wild, yet most homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief." The instant invocation of the joined terms wild and homely acknowledge the presence of the uncanny, the conflation of the familiar and the unfamiliar that we discussed in the first lecture. The wildness of the story is not in question, given the distanced descriptions of mutilated pets and murdered spouses, not to mention the repeated appearance of the titular black cat. The last portion of this sentence, where the narrator neither expects nor solicits belief, initially seems in line with Knickerbocker's decisions to avert rather than vouch for the truth. In this case, however, the narrator presents a first-hand account of his own experience, an experience that he himself finds unbelievable. Rhetorically, it appears as though the narrator desires that readers find him to be rational enough to know how irrational the story actually is. The importance of the conjunction of the wild and the homely, announced early, identifies Poe's intention to show how wild the home can be. The home here refers both to the domestic dwelling that the narrator shares with his wife and pets, and to the self as a site of home. This seems to echo the ghastly notion of our self behind ourself that we talked about with Dickinson's poem The First Day. And in particular, I believe that Poe contrasts a self that desires rational control, indicated through an insistence on logics of cause and effect. So that's on the one side, right? We have what I think Poe refers to as the I, and the I here desires control over both the self and the surrounding world. So that's one part of the self that Poe exposes. The other part desires its own subjective destitution, indicated by a series of murders of representations of that self. So on the one hand, there's the desire for control, mastery, and on the other hand, this I also wants to achieve death in the form of what Freud would call quiescence. It's a stilling of the self, a stilling of that inner turmoil, and it's ultimately the only way to ever achieve any sort of self-certainty. Part of Poe's story is horrifying because it exposes the fact that we never know what we're capable of doing. We never really can know who we are. And his use of the spirit of perverseness and that spirit, perverseness, that spirit is one that will seek our own undoing. It will seek to harm us. We desire our own self-destruction. We act against our own best interests. And given the fact that this lodges deep within the human soul, for Poe, it's a problem. you can't control or know yourself ultimately. This is doomed to failure. This is the only result. This is the end, ultimately, that Poe seems to indicate we all desire, given an entry into the logic of control. So that's what we'll be looking at today. The oddly doubled cats in the story, the black cat, the second black cat, Pluto, and the one that he finds as a replacement, serve as a reflection of the narrator's own self, which is doubled or halved. And halves and doubles both play a huge part in the story. And I think that the doubledness and the halvedness and the lack of an actual whole or something solid that isn't divided sets up Poe's first important point. We maintain only a flimsy grasp on the reality of the external world. We can't know it. It's beyond us. The narrator's next words help the reader understand that he experiences a lack of self-possession, and it's a lack of self-possession that most readers, if they're honest, would admit that they have to share. He writes, quote, "Mad indeed I would be to expect it, it being belief, in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad I am not, and very surely I do not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I would unburden my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world, plainly, succinctly, and without comment, a series of mere household events. In their consequence, these events have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me, yet I will not attempt to expound them." Rather than bringing an I, or a self capable of rejecting sensory input, the narrator argues that the senses reject their own evidence. Right? Usually we think of our senses as steeped in an I that senses things. What the narrator does in saying that the senses reject their own evidence is distance the sense of an I from having any sort of agency or control over the world. Does that make sense? The way that he phrases that? The narrator's sanity rests on his awareness of the limits of futural predictions instead of on the ability of his senses to translate impressions from reality. He can't trust his own senses to give him reality in a way that comports to his own way of thinking that the world should work. The narrator indicates his awareness of the diminished capacity in claiming only "mad I am not," which is a statement that falls short of claiming that he's sane. The next sentence shows Poe's interest in domesticating rather than taming the Gothic. If Irving tamed the Gothic by kind of neutering its horrifying side and only really showing off or focusing on its wonderful side, Poe really delights in not taming it, but showing its place in the home. And I think its roots in a home make the story far more terrifying than it would be in any other context. So rather than something like The Fall of the House of Usher, where the Gothic is set off into a distant world, Poe's mere household events eliminates the comfort of a distant plot. There's no allegory the way that there would be with The Mask of the Red Death. It's something that really strikes a chord at home. And I think that's how Poe intended it. Secondly, Poe explains that the problems with lacking an ability to trust our grasp of the world through the senses, which indicates an absolute mistrust of the self, requires some defense scheme that allows us to think ourselves rationally. And here's where I think the psychological horror of the story really sets in, because most of us, I think, at some point mistrust ourselves. Poe later gives ample reason to distrust ourselves, but what he gives us at the beginning is the solution, and it's a solution that I think is all too familiar. It's a scheme that, even if we don't recognize the source of it and the kind of madness that Poe's narrator has, it's still something that we do all the time. It's an embrace of causality. It's looking at things and indicating them in cause and effect relationships that create some sort of deterministic narrative that relieves us of responsibility while still letting us have the illusion of power or control. The narrator's emphasis on events that occur, especially events that he himself finds difficult to arrange in a valid logical sequence, opens the story to the potential reader's more responsible way of organizing the series of events, right? All he's going to do is list without comment, which he doesn't, the series of mere household events, which they are, right? But what he wants to have the reader do is frame them into a more responsible narrative. Here are the facts, put them into a narrative that isn't insane. And that's Poe's challenge to the reader. Can you do this? And the fact that we can, to an extent, or the fact that we can follow this narrator, the fact that we can follow his thinking should be horrifying. Because it shows the way, the power and the validity of our way of arranging the world in this very, very scientific way. There's a cause and effect, a cause and effect, a cause and effect. And if you can know all the causes, you can predict all the effects. And if you aren't the cause of your own actions, you have no responsibility, therefore no guilt. And it's very familiar as you start thinking about this way of thinking about one's own life, I think. That was a lot of things in the same sentence. Apologize for that. So the narrator understands that he perceives the situation as described as wild, but he believes it possible to contextualize the sequence of events with a less disturbing homely. Seeing his own process of logical ordering is corrupted by his excitability, the narrator offers the sequence of events to readers able to comprehend what occurred in terms of cause and effect. The first paragraph therefore reveals how the narrator desires and values a logical model of organization in narration and understands himself as incapable of meeting that standard. So rather than allow the homely to stake out a place within and against the wild, Poe encloses the Gothic events within a potentially logical framework provided by the presupposed reader that emphasizes rationality and predictability, and that's the kind of thinking that lets us feel at home, right? And so if one way that he could have written this story, which again, I mean, this is all focused on the uncanny, which is that combination of the wild and the homely. So you could have said, here's the wild, and what I want to do is make a place of home within the wild. And that's more what Irving does, right? He says, here's this beautiful, bountiful, wild world that we live in. Let's make our home in it. What Poe does is say, here's what we think of home, but what we think of home always already has a wildness in it that can't be controlled, both in terms of ourselves and in terms of our houses and in our domestic lives. And again, this is what's terrifying. This is what's beautiful. Do you see the difference between Irving and Poe? Does that make sense? Okay. So this is, I would argue, why the narrator beseeches some intellect that can reduce my phantasm to the commonplace, some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, which will perceive in the circumstances they detail with awe nothing more than an ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects. Poe thereby implies that readers who cannot determine an ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects are not more calm or logical than the narrator, and that should make the reader uncomfortable. Right? I mean, that's Poe's challenge. If you can't make this be ordinary, you're as crazy as I am. And that's hard to think about. You don't want to hear that about yourself, ever. Nobody would. The succession of events that conclude the paragraph, the events that, quote, have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me, show how the narrator understands the succession as extraordinary, not ordinary, right? I mean, it starts out through a psychological experience, terror, and it moves through physical experiences, torture, to a point of absolute subjective destitution or destruction. And that kind of tripartite framing of things is consistent throughout the narrative. He often punctuates things in terms of those threes that move in a very rapid succession from one point psychologically to another point of absolute annihilation. It's interesting. Note also the way that Poe draws the reader into the narrator's perspective. By simply providing a list of events for us to sort through, he exposes our willingness and ability to try to think rationally about events that have no rational explanation. The fact that we can and desire to do this exposes the strength and weakness of our rational abilities and the fact that we misapply them. Right? We use our rational capacities to sort through things that shouldn't be rational, that aren't rational, and we do it all the time. Put otherwise, Poe helps readers realize that our sanity is contingent on our not having mental schemes interrupted. To interpret bizarre realities through a sane lens is an insane response. Sanity doesn't always work. Sometimes, and I think that this is the unspoken upshot of the story, it seems better to allow questions to remain and admit that we can't understand everything. Because the work of understanding feeds into the illusion that we have any sort of control. And the fact that that control failures pushes us to this point where we desire our own death instead. One notable instance of the narrator's insistence on imposing a rational order, particularly causality over unnatural experience, occurs on the night that he kills his cat. Causal chains are important because they enable the narrator to have influence without needing to take responsibility. And this is the logic that justifies much violence within American politics. Think about how many of the shootings by policemen are justified in terms of causality, right? And it's a causality that removes the need for individual police officers to take responsibility for what was done. They're exonerated in really odd ways, but they're exonerated through a logic of causality. Do you see where this logic occurs and is pervasive? Same thing happens with drone strikes, right? Or any kind of bombing, right? It's no one person's fault. The blame is displaced into a causal chain through which one simply behaves as part of that chain and doesn't have to take responsibility. Nonetheless, they still have the power that comes through being able to enact some sort of discipline, control, violence, or harm. Does that make sense? Okay. So, the evening after the narrator hung his cat on the gallows, he was, quote, aroused from sleep by the cry of fire. Because the whole house was blazing, the destruction was complete, and the narrator's entire worldly wealth was swallowed up, making the narrator resign himself to despair. The narrator states, quote, I am above the weakness of seeking to establish a sequence of cause and effect. He's not. Between the disaster and the atrocity. But instantly, he arranges a logical reconstruction under the guise of detailing a chain of facts when he wishes to not leave even a possible link imperfect. Right? And so on the one hand, he realizes that the notion of cause and effect, that whole desire is a weakness. Nonetheless, he can't help but do it in order to make an inviolable link that absolves him of any responsibility. So here's what he sets up in his chain of facts. Actually, not quite yet. The narrator's unreliability is partly manifest in his inconsistent attitude toward causal order, but you can also look at the way that he places the term disaster parallel to cause and atrocity is parallel to the effect, right? I mean, just in the grammar of that sentence, let me find it here again. To establish a sequence of cause and effect between the disaster cause and the atrocity effect. What happened first was the atrocity of his torturing his cat. The disaster would be the house fire. What he does in even arranging the grammar of that sentence is to reverse it so that the disaster causes the atrocity, which is interesting, and it's a great way to absolve himself of any blame. Do you see how this is working consistently at the level of the sentence? Assuming that the fire is the disaster and the lynching is the atrocity, Poe shows that the narrator either wishes to depict his actions as a response to an event that occurred afterward, whereby it was caused and he was not responsible, or to establish that the loss of his worldly wealth is the atrocity, and that hanging the cat is a disaster that occurred despite him. Right? A disaster isn't something that you have responsibility over. It simply occurs in spite of oneself. Either way you see the sentence reveals how a chain of facts can be conveniently generated and biased toward ends that exculpate us, that relieve us of guilt. The continuation of the logic shows how even a logical system can break down with results that are hilarious, even though their import is doubly serious. Against this frenzied series of events, the narrator uses reason to restore his illusions of self-mastery, self-control. He writes, quote, but at length reflection came to my aid, and he surmises that upon the alarm of fire, the animal had been cut from the tree and thrown through an open window into my chamber with the view of arousing me from sleep. Having explained the presence of the cat's body in the room, the narrator surmises that, quote, the falling of other balls had compressed the victim of my cruelty into the substance of the freshly spread plaster, the lime of which, with the flames and the ammonia from the carcass, then accomplished the portraiture as I saw it. The psychological argument that someone throwing a cat carcass into a house to wake up its owner is as flimsy as the science that suggests that the image of a cat can be reproduced in this fashion. It doesn't work. There's no way that it makes sense. But while we might not be confronted with burning cats, Poe uses the scene to show how our tendency is to reconstruct reality in ways that are homely and familiar, even when they're neither of those things, and how that tendency that we have is highly problematic. The problem of it goes absolutely unrecognized because we live in a world where this is held as the only and paramount value. Make sense so far? Poe makes the third point. The psychological effects of requiring mastery and control in the world around us makes us feel helpless. The goal of prioritizing control is to empower us. Its actual consequence is to make us helpless and to realize how helpless we are. So, after the arrival of the second cat, the narrator's disposition alters irrevocably. He writes, quote, "Beneath the pressure of torments such as these, the feeble remnants of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates," unquote. And he describes an escalation of the irrational experienced in terms of violence. Quote, "The moodiness of my usual temper increased to hatred of all things and of all mankind, while from the sudden, frequent, and ungovernable outbursts of a fury to which I now blindly abandoned myself, my uncomplaining wife, alas, was the most usual and the most patient of sufferers," end quote. Poe invokes the horror of domestic violence, while the narrator steadfastly sees these outbursts as caused by the torments of the cat, as ungovernable effects to which he blindly abandoned myself. The myself appears as a term that portrays the narrator as an affected object of manipulation, a sight that passively undergoes an experience. The narrator thus does not consider himself responsible for his actions. I didn't do these things. These things were done by myself, and that's a myself that the I has no responsibility over. Right? The myself is something determined by external forces. The I is something that can choose. Any violence done is done by myself. I do not do it. I do not have responsibility. That which controls myself does. Does that thinking make sense? That slight shift? I mean, Sartre would call that just bad faith, right? Simply switching from the transcendent, free I, to a determined me. And Poe is kind of recreating that problem earlier when Sartre was writing about it, just in terms of literature instead of philosophy. Does that make sense? Okay. So although it would seem counterintuitive, Poe points out ways that humans seek to become masters while abdicating responsibilities for their actions. This tendency to feel empowered without feeling burdened explains much about the use of power in our modern world. And it's horrifying. But that's the logic underneath it. Poe indicates that the second cat is responsible for interrupting the narrator's self-control. Instead of being the one who caresses, the narrator finds that the cat would, quote, "spring upon my knees, covering me with its loathsome caresses." The fact that the cat, quote, "would get between my feet and thus nearly throw me down," quote, shows that the cat anticipated where the narrator would walk, making the narrator follow it. The cat pushed itself upon the narrator's breast and limited the narrator's possible actions. Quote, "Although I longed to destroy it with a blow, I was yet withheld from doing so, partly by a memory of my former crime, but chiefly, let me confess it at once, by absolute dread of the beast," end quote. While the narrator terrorized Pluto, the first cat, the second cat dispossesses the narrator of his ability to control the fears of others through embodying the sign of the gallows, written all in quotes, that become clarified in the cat's white fur, a sign that unites each phantasm of the cat. And again, there are three cats. There's three apparitions or appearances of the cat. The first one is Pluto. The second one is the appearance of the cat on the wall that he describes, that whole ammonia plaster scenario. And the third one is the second cat, which contains both signs of the lynched cat and Pluto himself, right? He only has one eye. It's an odd echo or an odd reoccurrence that seems to make it unclear whether there's one cat or two or three. It's a really well done sense of Gothic mathematics, because in Gothic stories, a lot of times things don't add up. And that's one of the delights of the Gothic, is just looking at our mathematical tendencies to make sure things add up and thwarting it intentionally. And that's what a lot of good Gothic stories will do.
And the third one is white-breasted.
Yeah, there's a white patch on it, and as the story goes on, that patch becomes clarified as a gallows. Mm-hmm. So the narrator wants to have some amount of control, but he finds that he can control neither the external world nor his own self. The narrator thus resorts to a calculating mindset, the same kind of reductive mental work that Irving endowed Crane with. We see this as a fourth kind of suspicion from Poe. Abstracted calculative thinking spares us the responsibility required by emotional engagement. Thus, the narrator is able to dispatch his wife in only 2 sentences before dwelling for prolonged paragraphs on how to best conceal the evidence. The whole of this scene shows the ugly side of calculative thought, the fact that it works, and the fact that it diminishes our ethical sensitivity. The narrator writes, quote, "This hideous murder accomplished, I set myself forthwith, and with entire deliberation, to the task of concealing the body." Again, there's not his wife, it's just the body or it throughout. There's no personal emotional attachment. There's no relationship to it. It's simply an object. Without his wife, the narrator commands his myself to act based on his entire deliberation. He imagines a number of ways to eliminate the body. Quote, "Cutting the corpse into minute fragments and destroying them by fire, digging a grave for it in the floor of the cellar, casting it in the well in the yard, packing it in a box as if merchandise," end quote. He treats his wife's still bleeding body as mere meat residue. There's nothing emotional that connects it. The narrator finally decides, quote, to wall it up in the cellar, an action that incorporates his wife's body, the it, into the foundation of his home. The cellar was, quote, admirably adapted to this purpose, with walls loosely constructed and with a rough plaster that the atmosphere had prevented from hardening, end quote. The narrator adds that he, quote, "made no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks at this point, insert the corpse, and wall up the hole as if before, so that no eye could detect anything suspicious." And again, all throughout, both with the removal of the cat's eye and throughout the whole story, as you read it, don't forget that I equals I. That no eye could suspect it. He's still trying to prevent this eye from having to take any sort of responsibility or blame for what's going on. It's all about what myself is doing at this point, not about the eye. Very, very conveniently. The emphasis on making no doubt, with overtones of constructing an error-free space, betrays the existence of a mindset so intent upon conviction that it wills blindness to alternative possibilities. The narrator is successful, quote, "In this calculation, I was not deceived," right? Senses can deceive him. In calculation, in that kind of abstracted mental work, the eye remains undeceived. That's how the eye retains control and mastery, is through abstracted calculation, not through emotional reception or even sensory reception. Despite his having accounted for everything according to his reason and calculation, however, the narrator nonetheless finds himself arrested for murder. Poe thereby portrays how operating according to reason and acknowledging a drive for causes and effects cannot account for all possible or probable factors. Put simply, Poe indicates that in our hearts, we are not at home in reason. We can't dwell in reason alone. So that's one way to look at the story. A second way to approach it concerns an examination of the halves and doubles that proliferate throughout the text. These are important to note in light of the narrator's desire for and violence against the entities he finds reflecting him. The horror seems to go beyond Rip Van Winkle's uncanny encounter with his face and name on another body, especially when he couldn't even recognize himself. Irving made that a comical moment. Poe doesn't. He makes it horrifying. Here, the violence with which the narrator dispatches a double shows its roots in a self-hatred seemingly spawned by an inability to control or master the self. Problematically, neither two halves nor one double seem to render anything whole. So, let's go back to the text. As the cast potentially multiply throughout the story, and as the narrator continues to assert control over them, Poe shows the effects as a diminution of the narrator who finds himself to be increasingly fragmented. So, calling on the image of the cat and rope left in the remaining wall an apparition, the narrator remarks that he is unable to rid himself of the phantasm of the cat, writing that he felt return into his spirit, quote, "a half sentiment that seemed but was not remorse," end quote. The narrator also recalls feeling a sentiment half of horror, half of remorse, the night after he extracted Pluto's eye. The narrator's various half feelings never necessarily equal a whole, and that creates an uncanny mathematics that show the infinite possibilities that emerge through the splitting of the self. If Crayon had demonstrated the peace that comes from an easy faith and a willingness to be deceived, Poe's narrator embodies the despair that comes from a desire to secure mastery and certainty. In this case, Poe shows how the result of mastery, again, is a feeling of incompleteness and fractionality. Is that making sense? The more you try to will yourself to be complete, the more you have all these half feelings. The more that you use reason, in its logics of control to create an I that has full mastery, the more the lack of that mastery appears. The more problems emerge. The more struggles one finds. He's not whole. Make sense? To repair the intolerable lack, Poe's narrator begins looking, quote, among the vile haunts which I now habitually frequented, for another pet of the same species and of somewhat similar appearance with which to supply its place, end quote. The chosen haunts that serve illicit spirits, a fitting place to find a pet of the same species, which leaves undetermined whether the cat is feline or demon in nature. To supply its place also presupposes the narrator's functional understanding of lack. What is desired is not something that will replace the first cat, but an entity that allows the narrator to externalize the self that he longs to destroy. Right? A place is being supplied. Nothing's being replaced. There's a placeholder for something that he can have some sort of really destructive relationship with. What goes into that slot is less important than the fact that something occupied that spot. It's an externalization of himself, and he needs an object on which to externalize. That's how I understand the supply its place. One night, as the narrator sits half stupefied, it's another reference to his bifurcated status, he finds, quote, some black object that he realizes is a cat fully as large as Pluto and closely resembling him in every aspect but one. This cat had a large, although nearly indefinite splotch of white covering nearly the whole region of its breast. And again, nearly the whole is not the whole. Everything in this story remains fragmented, like the brick plastered, or the plastered over bricks in the basement. This cat evinced a disposition to accompany the narrator, who permitted it to do so, occasionally stooping and patting it as I proceeded. The cat therefore doubles Pluto, the first cat, both in appearance and in behavior. Poe shows that the cat makes itself part of the narrator's home, stating that it domesticated itself at once upon reaching the narrator's house, where it became immediately a great favorite with my wife. The narrator soon discovers a dislike to it rising within me, a phrase written in the narrator's revealingly passive voice. Again, it's not something that I think or I feel, something arises within him that he does not control. Finding that the cat's evident fondness disgusted and annoyed him, the narrator soon is moved to the bitterness of hatred, and he begins avoiding the creature, accompanied by shame when remembering his former deed of cruelty, which prevents him from physically abusing it. Although he does not recognize the embodied feline as the phantasm that he had simultaneously desired and dreaded, the cat begins to serve as the cause of the narrator's actions. And this is an interesting shift in the story. The narrator begins to, quote, flee silently from its odious presence as from the breath of a pestilence. The narrator attributes the increase of his dislike to the discovery that the new cat, unnamed, quote, also had been deprived of one of its eyes, which only endeared it to the narrator's wife. This reminds the narrator that his wife possessed, quote, in a high degree, that humanity of feeling, which had once been my distinguishing trait and the source of many of my simplest and purest pleasures. More than disclosing the narrator's inhumanity, Poe also shows how the kinds of moral theories that arise out of reason are out of place. There's something primarily human about feeling rather than reasoning that should be a side of ethics. And again, that's part of my larger claim that Gothic stories create a compatible but rival ethical theory to what most Enlightenment models of like deontology or utilitarianism would do, going back to the first week's lecture. Additionally, because his wife now is what had been his distinguishing trait, it's a trait he no longer possesses. The narrator sees her as his double, a double of who he really is / was, that he can recognize but not remain able to recognize himself as being. So, we okay so far? More or less. The series of grotesque torture scenes reinforce how Pluto and the wife are externalizations of the narrator's desire to die. Let's investigate how Poe ties in the points outlined above: the need for power without responsibility, how desire and control makes us terrified of our impotence, the drive for wholeness, through doubling halves or having doubles, into Pluto's torture scene. It begins when the narrator enters, drunk, and Pluto wounds the narrator's hands with its teeth. This results in a transformation in the narrator's character beyond the influence of the fiend and temperance in an event that alters the relationship of the I and the me within the narrator's self. At the moment when the black cat's teeth penetrate the narrator's white body, several versions of self-displacement are articulated, any one of which serve to relieve the narrator of responsibility. So again, what the narrator thinks he wants the whole time is for the I to be the source, cause, and master of everything in the surrounding world. As soon as something happens that he does not want to take responsibility for, that space for the I is left blank, and it's translated into a me that undergoes an experience. And so anything that would cause an action is not this I, it's something else that causes it that goes into a me. And this paragraph is filled with other things that are not the I that cause him to torture his cat. So, the fury of a demon instantly possessed me. I knew myself no longer. I mean, do you see how he does that? I knew myself no longer. My original soul seemed at once to take a flight from its flight from my body, and a more than fiendish malevolence, gin nurtured, thrilled every fiber of my frame. End quote. In addition to showing how the narrator resorts to substance abuse as a way to achieve a subjective destitution, right? It's not my fault I've been drinking. It's the spirit of alcohol that's acting, not my own gentle spirit that I have. So, I mean, there's part of that. But when you read this, the cause of the narrator's actions, for which he's not responsible, is variously ascribed to possession by the fury of the demon and the incorporation of a more than fiendish malevolence, thrilling every fiber of the narrator's body. This demonic fury and fiendish malevolence emerge as Pluto bites the narrator, although Poe leaves ambiguous whether it's caused by Pluto's penetration into the narrator's body or the fact that Pluto no longer acknowledges the narrator's centrality in the promotion of his desire. After having exculpated himself by limiting his self-possession, the narrator writes, quote, I took from my waistcoat pocket a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut one of its eyes from the socket. I blush, I burn, I shudder, while I pen the damnable atrocity. End quote. The series of events, starting with taking a penknife, allows the narrator to begin speaking once again of his own agency, especially as he rids the I from that which stole his ability to command desire. Right? He eliminates the cat's I, but the I does it. That's why he repeats the word I 4 times in that sentence in a really short succession. As he's writing it, he understands himself as regaining mastery as an I again, rather than having something occur as me. There's a Gothic horror to the blinding of the cat, definitely. It's really disturbing. But I think at a deeper level, there's a horror of an I that cannot admit to its own lack of control. And that's horrifying. The wife, of course, also stands as someone the narrator sees as an external version of himself, which, like himself, also cannot be controlled. The narrator remarks that he was, quote, happy to find in my wife a disposition not uncongenial with my own, end quote. The use of my, in referring to my wife, shows that the narrator remembers having had a power in this relationship that reminded him of the power that his animals gave him. Problematically, however, his wife's attempts to please him undermine his sense of control. Quote, observing my partiality for domestic pets, she lost no opportunity of procuring those of the most agreeable kind. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat, end quote. Although his needs are gratified, the narrator becomes the object of his wife's affections, and he becomes dependent upon her instead of the other way around. While the proliferation of pets who rely upon the narrator masks this change, Poe reveals the reversal within the marital power dynamic. That the wife has a disposition similar to that of the narrator creates a similar internal tension from the narrator's perspective. It provides them with a foundation for happy companionship, but problematically allows the narrator to see himself doubled, made redundant in her character. She becomes the I that the narrator simultaneously wants to be, and also, given his drive for subjective destitution, that he wants to destroy. He still sees himself reflected in her, however, and thus suffers myself while beating her. It's really weird phrasing as you go through and look at how he describes domestic violence. He suffers myself to beat her. Ultimately, he finds his wife's presence intolerable and violently reclaims his sense of I, symbolically mediated through the extracting of the eye of the cat, as we just talked about, and also killing the woman who reminded him of how he once was. It's a way of killing himself. Does that make sense? If you eliminate all the doubles, you can make yourself whole again. The fact that there are doubles is a work of the self that he's not acknowledging or taking responsibility for. They just appear, and he must destroy them. The final double, though, or half that we'll discuss today, is invoked in the story at the structural level of the narrator's personality. Integrating the numerous internal divisions that the narrator notes, the half-sentiments, the half-stupors, the half-terrors, Poe provides the following analysis, quote, "And then came, as if to my final and irrevocable overthrow, the spirit of perverseness," all caps. "This spirit precedes the work of reason or materialism." He writes, quote, "Philosophy takes no account, and phrenology finds no place for it among the organs," end quote. Unable to be reduced to mind or body, the narrator writes that, quote, "Yet I am not more sure that my soul lives than I am that perverseness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart, one of the indivisible primary faculties or sentiments which give direction to the character of man," end quote. Claiming that humans violate that which is law merely because we understand it to be such, the narrator describes it as, quote, "this unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrong for the wrong's sake only," end quote. This description of the spirit of perverseness clarifies many of the oddities of the narrator's prose prior to this point. The fact that he claims that the spirit will, quote, "offer violence to its own nature," suggests why the narrator's description of beating his wife, offering violence to her, is something that he suffers myself. In the end of the paragraph, the narrator describes killing Pluto, the first cat, quote, "the unoffending brute," is how he describes him, stating that he, quote, "hung it with tears streaming from my eyes and with the bitterest remorse at my heart. Hung it because I knew that it had loved me, and because I felt it had given me no reason of offense. Hung it because I knew that in doing so I was committing a sin that would place me beyond the hands of the most merciful and most terrible God," end quote. Replacing the series of seeming bifurcations, the spirit of perverseness incorporates the narrator and motivates the failure of his reason, upsetting his desire for calculation in sequential order. Instead of being driven out of a pure, rational, universal, or disinterested regard for other living things, or from being motivated primarily by self-interest, Poe's narrator exemplifies how the human heart is a perverse thing that haunts thoughts and actions from within. At the core of his projects of control and creating certainty, Poe's narrator locates that which makes any sense of assurance impossible, an inner wildness that refuses to be domesticated, which surfaces to enact our own self-destruction. Based on the desire of the soul to vex itself, I interpret the narrator's actions as motivated by a drive towards subjective destitution, or the undoing, instead of the integration, of the self. This subjective destitution emerges as a pattern. The narrator attempts to eliminate symbolic objects that serve as doubles of his I, and finally acts to ensure the collapse of the I/myself binary into the single potentiallessness of a corpse. And that's the importance of him writing the day before his execution. He's achieved his own death, passively, by the hands of others. Any questions about that so far?
It's kind of the origin of, well, there was another term for it, but one of them was the Twinkie defense, or what was the main one?
I mean, they're all versions of the insanity plea. And I mean, temporary insanity will come up, but all of that looks at the lack of an I who has the authority to engineer one's own actions. So any kind of defense will do that, right? The I am not responsible for the actions that myself caused, because other things affected myself beyond the power of my I to control it. Zach?
So is this one part of him that actively desires his own death merely one of the fragments that's vying for control within him, or is it a more genuinely moral part of himself?
It's the spirit of perverseness, which desires to vex itself.
So there's no connection to morality.
I think what he's ultimately arguing is that morality is a way to control that spirit of perverseness, which is always going to be more primal and more at home within us than we want it to be. It can't be eradicated. It's whole. That's terrifying.
And so this part of himself isn't compelled to wish his demise because of some moral sensibility. It's just the
No.
desire for
It's the
destruction
desire to vex
and
itself.
self-sabotage.
Yeah. Implications. All right.
You did good.
Number one, Poe's story is rooted in a will to control that arises to supplement a feeling of disempowerment. The sense of control is performed rationally through the imposition of causal logic, through a calculating detachment, and through a distanced use of violence. All of which seek to compensate for, but only reinforce, the feeling of not being in control. Number two, the type of control that the narrator finds most distressing is an inability to control pleasure, either his own pleasure or as serving as the unique site of the pleasure of others. Violence is his response to this lack of mastery. When carrots fail, the narrator resorts to sticks. Number three, the root cause of the narrator's displeasure is a lack of an ability to trust himself. This is seen through the spirit of perverseness, the fact that his senses reject their own evidence, the fact that he cannot rectify the split between an active I and the object me in the world around him. Ultimately, this anxiety results in violence against that which imperils his eye of control and that which reminds him of himself, and finally it's a violence against himself specifically. Once he is dead, there's no I, there's only the body of a me or a myself. The I is officially gone. That's the goal. Number four, the fact that Poe ties so much violence and horror into the space of the home shouldn't be overlooked. The Gothic horror of a demonic cat is secondary, outside of the narrator's mind, to the horror of an alcoholic bent on destruction. The fact that the narrator is willing to assault his wife and animals is a source of horror within the home. And that's a source of horror that exists today. You don't need to have a black cat or a demon to have violence occur at home. And that's horrifying. And it emerges when it's least suspected. And it's kept hidden. And it's kept secret. And it's terrible. Number five, don't overlook the connotations of slavery as it echoes throughout the Poe's story. The fact that Pluto is a black brute who is lynched isn't an accident. The space of blackness within the home, the anxieties of an inability to control those who are different, these are all problems that have increasingly real-world applications today. I mean, you can think of the Syrian refugee crisis, for example. We don't want people that look different. We want to control our own white space and not let others in. Although we may not have slaves that appear in our everyday lives, we still use technologies constructed by subsistence-level wage workers. We still get our food from people who can barely afford food and shelter. At local and national levels, we still promote, or at least are subjected to, divisive rhetorics intended to eliminate those whose skin color or religion isn't white enough. That's troubling. And on the subject of slaves, many of them were regarded as pets. Having been written right after the Nat Turner revolt, there are a lot of anxieties about slave uprisings. And what Poe is trying to communicate in this story with the spirit of perverseness, it doesn't matter how much love is given, there's something within the human soul that will vex even that which is good for it. There's no assurance against a slave uprising. There's no guarantee of safety, even within the space of the home. Finally, the fact that there are these problems in the world, Poe suggests, is because we have problems with ourselves. In many ways, all of our horror starts at home. Our home in ourselves and in our bodies and the domestic spaces where we dwell. And if that's true, perhaps the best solutions start there as well. Questions?
I don't have a question, but just I just saw a movie, so it's kind of on my mind. But like this is within yourself of changing responsibility from I to myself, and I'm just wondering what is that what happens when there's reframing of like a political argument? And the movie was Robert Redford's Truth about George Bush going AWOL from the National Guard. So Kate Blanchett finds all of this proof, but there is one little part of the proof that she doesn't vet well enough. So all of the argument is reframed on that particular little item rather than the real item of George Bush being AWOL. You know, so it just kind of, I mean, that's like an outside force doing the changing responsibility.
And it shifts blame away and shifts attention away from what's the real problem.
And maybe our media that does it every day, obviously. But,
Yeah.
I mean, does that even fit whatsoever? I don't know for sure.
I mean,
it's on my mind.
it's an example of, I mean, how truth is a question. I mean, part of it's just the question of what truth is or what truth means, but a lot of it, I think, is culturally and in terms of our world or our society, the way that we lose focus on what's truly important or what the heart of the matter is, and allow ourselves to be distracted from things that really matter. Because even more concerning about George W. Bush or his AWOL status is the fact that we're at war, right? The fact that people are dying all the time and we're killing them, and we're killing ourselves and our own people in order to pursue something that's really incoherent. And we don't talk about that. We talk about these little details instead, because it's really horrifying to think of what we're doing and who we are and what that says about the people of the United States when war is waged in our name and fought by people from our neighborhood that we allow to happen. But that's a hard thing to talk about. The actual concrete fact versus this fact versus this fact, it's far more distracting. It's easier. So we'll
It's easy to deflect
Yeah.
with media, right?
Yeah.
And celebrities or whatever.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm still having some trouble rationalizing his desire for his own death, especially as it relates to the very end of the story. And it seemed to me that the way he described everything is that he actually took solace in his self-perceived invincibility in that moment when he did tap against the wall. I definitely understand the extreme irony, but I thought that in his mind he was free of any sort of repercussion.
He was free, right? I mean, he could have been free. He didn't want to be free. I mean, that's how I would read that end scene, right? By drawing attention to the place. I mean, could it have broken through? I mean, the cat ends up howling, which is the most dramatic way to end it,
He
right?
specifically mentions the walls, which is the
Right.
last thing he would have wanted to do.
You know, but by drawing attention, by keeping the cops there, by rapping on it, like he's doing everything he can to draw as much attention to that place as possible so that he can be exposed and killed.
Mhm.
That's how I would read. I mean, there's
I see,
hundreds of
yeah.
ways to read it, but that's how I would look at him sowing the seeds that would result in his own self-destruction.
Mhm.
Other questions?
Okay, so when he does the splitting, the halving of himself, and like replaces himself with the cat that he kills, how is that not satisfying to him?
But he doesn't really have himself. When he looks at I mean, he doesn't have a good sense of the I that acts ever, right? And so when he reflects on himself, his self-reflection at what the me is appears as a series of halves, right? And so it's not ever like he's using that as like a mathematical, oh, the cat is half me or something like that.
Right.
When he looks back at himself, he sees a series of splits. When he looks outside of himself, he sees something like the wife that reflects himself, right? But when he thinks about the I, he interprets that I solely through its capacity to control and have agency and autonomy or something like that. And so what happens with the cat is that the cat seems to take over that role of the I as a causal actor, right? So it's not that it's the cat's replacing him in some way. It's the fact that the cat has more agency than he does. And he thinks that there's only one I that can be active. And he needs to be that I. And if that means taking the I out of the cat, who has infringed on his own sense of personal agency, that's what he has to do, right? If he has to kill his wife, who reminds him too much of himself at different times, who also has more agency than he does, whom he fears, he'll do that. Zach?
You were talking about how he removed the I from the cat, and I think it's just interesting to recognize that Pluto is the Roman god of the underworld.
Yeah.
He's the master of death. He's
Yeah.
trying to assert his dominance over the master of death.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is very cool.
It is very cool. Yeah, it's part of what I like. I mean, there's so many great little ins and outs through all the sentences, through all the things. You know, the fact that the cat is the only thing that has the only name in the story is Pluto. It's the only name that's given, right? The narrator remains unnamed, the wife remains unnamed. It's just Pluto, and that's it. Anything else?
How are we supposed to interpret the idea that the story began with this pure childish love of animals, and it very quickly and extremely deteriorated into something really morbid and cruel?
Well, the love of animals, his love of animals is all about his ability to take animals and make their pleasure dependent on his agency.
Mm-hmm.
Right? What he loves about animals is that they depend on him and thereby give him power. And as soon as Pluto likes his wife better than him, he's lost that source of power and pleasure. He no longer can control the pleasure of others and therefore loses his appetite for animals altogether. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, he's also bit by Pluto though too,
Right.
which is, yeah.
And he comes home raving drunk and gets bit and decides to carefully and surgically extract an eye. Yeah.
Yeah, it just touches on that perverseness.
Yeah.
That's what surfaces
Yeah.
immediately.
Yeah. And again, I mean, in some ways, I'm almost suspicious of that. Like looking at the Vitus Accost, because he, again, in that scene, he lists like 6 extenuating factors that absolve him of all responsibility for what he did. It's not my fault I tortured my cat. I mean, it's mutilation, not my fault. Here are the 6 things that happen that make me not at fault for it. You know, but that to me is super suspicious. You shouldn't need that many reasons to not be at fault for something you shouldn't do. And even more than the spirit of perverseness rising up, which I think, I mean, he attributes that to the lynching of the cat, not the extraction of the eye, right? Perverseness comes when he decides to kill the cat, even though it was not offensive, even though he loved it, even though it loved him. You know, the cutting out of the eye is just something, I really think it comes back to this. But he can't recognize that that's what's motivating his actions, because he can't recognize that he's powerless and trying to assert power, because that would expose the whole system. So he just lets it go.
And in his drunken stupor, he impulsively tries to grab the cat.
Yeah.
And grasp it in his hands.
Control it.
Yeah.
Do you see the importance of looking at how he writes about himself actively and passively, though, in terms of a logic of power and control, in terms of power and responsibility? I mean, do you see where just really at a basic sentence level, how you can analyze a lot of things that occur in the news or in the society or in conversations around you in terms of looking at those who desire power without responsibility, those who want to put upon things a filter of cause and effect that absolve them of responsibility but still make them have influence, and to see violence as a response to all of that. I mean, do you see where that all connects?
Definitely the Syrian refugee crisis is a perfect example, because it's been now years where they've been arguing in every European Parliament and in the United States Congress about whether or not we can accept any refugees. And obviously everyone wants to say, no, we can't. But you can't really say that until you have a reason. And last weekend provided a perfect reason.
It provided a reason.
Yeah, it
Right.
was the cause for Poe's narrator's effect.
Yeah. Disaster and atrocity, right? The atrocity of our unwillingness to accept refugees is caused by the disaster, which postdates the atrocity itself. But it's easy justification.
To answer your question, when in Poe's life did he write The Black Cat? Is this late Poe?
It's he was living in Philadelphia. Actually, I got to visit the house where he lived in 6 houses in Philadelphia while he was hanging out with Virginia. So it was, I mean, he had a really short career overall, but it was toward like the either the beginning of the end or after the early part, somewhere in that kind of middle span.
Is there any other Poe work that sort of reflects this?
Oh, I mean, the Telltale Heart is another version of this. I mean, yeah, I mean, see, I mean, you have a lot of those murder stories.
The Cask of Amontillado.
Yeah, the Cask of Amontillado would be another one. You know, where there's a jealousy and an entombment and things like that. Like, there's a lot of even The Fall of the House of Usher features an early entombment. I mean, Being Buried Alive, Berenice does that. Like, a lot of his short horror fiction really looks at when somebody's dead, when they're not dead, what causes murder, the insanity of the self, and just the human inability to actually achieve any sort of certainty in the world at all. And that's, if anything, that Poe writes about thematically, it's an absolute lack of certainty, which is horrifying, and it motivates a lot of the horror that he elaborates in rather grotesque fashions. Zach?
So, what's the significance of his failing to notice certain things about the cat? It takes him an entire day to notice that it's missing an eye, even though he takes it home with him. He spends hours immuring his wife in the wall and doesn't realize that the cat is in there occupying the space with her.
It would be, I mean, I think when he begins the story saying that his senses reject their own evidence, I mean, he's one of the most unreliable narrators. I mean, clearly, right? He's not a reliable narrator of his own experiences by his own admission. And from that point on, you just have to say, I don't know if he fabricates all of it. You know, if there's no white patch that looks like the gallows, if that's his own. I mean, and again, that's a question of what really happens in a bizarre fiction story that's hard to say. You know, I think that really, does he really not notice? Is it really there? I mean, you can make arguments for or against either way, but those become difficult arguments to support on one side or the other. You know, you can't say, I mean, you could have a reading of the story that was consistent one way or consistent the other, but ultimately I don't know that it really weighs in on the real heart of the center of the text. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for coming to class.